I experienced 3 days of absolute, deafening nothingness, and that profound silence nearly destroyed me before my own sons ever uttered a single word. You want to understand what it feels like to love someone so deeply, so unconditionally, that it slowly morphs into a quiet, internal agony? Let me explain it to you. It feels like standing in your kitchen at 2 o'clock in the morning, staring fixedly at a mobile telephone that refuses to illuminate or ring, entirely paralyzed by the harrowing conviction that your own flesh and blood is lying injured, cold, and abandoned somewhere on a dark Birmingham side street. That was me, 52 years old, gripping a heavy ceramic mug so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white, waiting desperately for two grown men to acknowledge my existence. My name is Julian Cooper. I manage Anvil Engineering, an enterprise I built from the ground up out of an industrial district in Birmingham. We are the quiet backbone that calibrates, repairs, and maintains the critical monitoring equipment hospitals cannot survive without. Intensive care units, complex surgical lasers, the machinery that beeps, hums, and sustains human respiration. I understand the machinery of life because I spent a lifetime mastering how to keep things from breaking down. Yet, for all my professional competence, I was utterly helpless against the quiet erosion of my own family. I built that business with my own calloused hands and aching back, ensuring my boys would never experience the biting chill of deprivation. My own father departed when I was 7 years old, walking out of the front door without a backward glance and never returning. Nobody taught me how to throw a cricket ball. Nobody ever sat by my bedside during a fever to reassure me that my life mattered. So, when Arthur was born, and then Alistair 2 years later, I made a sacred, silent vow standing in that sterile hospital corridor. These boys would never experience that hollow, bottomless emptiness. I kept that absolute promise for 25 relentless years, pouring every ounce of my soul, my resources, and my protection into their paths. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday in late May, that 25-year monument of devotion dissolved into the most harrowing 3 days of my entire existence. There is a unique cruelty in the mathematics of parenthood. The more you sacrifice to build a sturdy bridge for your children, the further away they walk, entirely forgetting the abyss beneath them. For 25 years, my love was defined by constant presence, by financial vigilance, and by an unwavering readiness to fix every crisis before it could touch them. But as I stood there in the dark of 2 a.m., watching the digital clock change its numbers without a single notification, I began to realize a terrifying truth. The silence on the other end of the line was not an accident. It was a deliberate wall, built brick by the very hands I'd spent a lifetime protecting. That suffocating night eventually bled into a gray, unforgiving dawn, offering no resolution, only the relentless ticking of reality. The crisis did not announce itself with a dramatic structural collapse or a hospital siren. It arrived on the heavy white cardstock of a standard residential correspondence, left neatly in my office tray. It was a formal lease renewal notice for Arthur's residence, a sleek, glass-fronted apartment situated in the heart of Manchester's exclusive Spinningfields district, overlooking the quiet flow of the River Irwell. 2 years prior, when Arthur secured his initial corporate position in the city, the property management required a solid financial anchor. I stepped in as his guarantor. My name, my accumulated credit standing, and my signature held that entire high-rise arrangement securely in place, an invisible steel beam ensuring he could walk the polished corridors of success without ever feeling the dead weight of vulnerability. The renewal deadline was precisely 5 days away. Before authorizing my signature, I needed one brief, mundane confirmation from Arthur, a technical detail regarding his income documentation that the property administrators required cleared up. It was supposed to be a simple, unremarkable interaction. One telephone call, 30 seconds maximum, to keep the machinery of our family obligations running smoothly. I dialed his number from my desk at Anvil Engineering, leaning back while half-watching a digital monitoring screen through the glass partition. The call went straight to voicemail. At first, logic intervened. He was a young professional, likely occupied in a high-stakes boardroom meeting or reviewing client portfolios. I recorded a calm, measured message. "Arthur, it is your father. I have the lease renewal documents here. I need to verify a quick detail with you before I sign. Return my call when convenient. No urgency." By the following afternoon, however, the digital landscape remained chillingly vacant. No callback. No text message acknowledging the looming deadline. A flicker of unease began to stir beneath my ribs, a sharp contrast to the precise, predictable environment I managed every day. While Arthur occasionally delayed returning missed calls, he had never simply vanished into digital ether for an entire day. Driven by a growing instinct that something was amiss, I contacted Alistair, assuming he would at least know his younger brother's whereabouts, perhaps dining out with colleagues in Manchester's vibrant northern quarter or unwinding after a demanding week. Alistair's phone rang out into the identical void of voicemail. Both sons, completely unreachable on the exact same afternoon. I tried to rationalize the anomaly, telling myself that modern youth simply live at a frantic pace, detached from the simple courtesy of a ringtone. I left another message, maintaining an outward composure that masked a rapidly tightening chest. "Boys, I genuinely need to hear from you regarding Arthur's lease renewal deadline. Please telephone me as soon as you are free." That evening, during our quiet supper at home in Birmingham, Margaret noticed the subtle fracture in my composure before I could even voice it. My wife has known me for 28 years. She reads a shift in the lines around my eyes and the cadence of my breathing before I am fully aware of them myself. She paused, her fork resting beside her plate, and observed the untouched meal before me. "You have scarcely touched your supper," she noted softly. "What is troubling you so deeply tonight?" I looked across the table, feeling the weight of the silence pressing against the walls of our dining room. "The boys are not answering," I replied, the words tasting like ash. "Neither of them. Since yesterday afternoon." Margaret offered a gentle, anchoring smile, attempting to dispel the gathering storm. "They are busy, Julian. They are adult men building their own lives." She was entirely right in theory. They were grown men capable of navigating the world. Yet, as I stared at her, an unsettling pressure bloomed behind my breastbone, a deep, visceral premonition that this silence was not born of mere busyness, but of a deliberate, calculated distance. By the third day, the threshold between administrative delay and absolute terror had been crossed. The lease renewal window was now narrowing down to a breathless 48 hours, and my 14 cumulative phone calls had all dissolved into the same indifferent automated voice. That was the moment Margaret's gentle reassurance dissolved, replaced by the heavy, shared realization that something structural had fractured within our family. Without a word of argument or hesitation, she walked upstairs, retrieved our travel cases from the wardrobe, and began packing. After 28 years of standing shoulder to shoulder through life's trials, we both understood which instincts required absolute obedience. We did not discuss options or debate whether we were overreacting. We simply locked the front door, secured our tickets for the morning train departing from Birmingham New Street, and headed north toward Manchester, moving inexorably toward a truth neither of us was prepared to face. The platform at Birmingham New Street was alive with the restless hum of early morning commuters. Yet to Margaret and me, the station felt suspended in a vacuum of profound isolation. We secured seats on the northbound express train, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels against the tracks setting a relentless pace for our journey toward Manchester. As the train accelerated past the sprawling urban periphery and out into the vast, mist-shrouded English countryside, my mind involuntarily began replaying every catastrophic scenario appearance imagination could forge. I visualized a severe motorway collision along the M6, an unexpected medical emergency within a locked apartment, or some silent, irreversible tragedy occurring behind closed doors while we sat miles away, oblivious. Every mile north felt like pressing deeper into an uncertain fog, where the rules of the world I had meticulously built and maintained no longer applied. Staring blankly at the condensation gathering on the carriage window, my thoughts drifted beyond the immediate panic, settling into a heavy, contemplative ache regarding the generation we had raised. Arthur and Alastair belonged to what I privately termed the sheltered generation, young men shaped by absolute comfort, whose lives had been painstakingly paved with financial security, strong credit scores, and invisible safety nets. They had never experienced the bitter bite of true deprivation, nor had they ever stood shivering in the biting frost of genuine vulnerability. Yet, paradoxically, this absolute immunity to hardship had bred a profound impatience, an ironic hunger for a manufactured independence. They yearned to prove their self-reliance precisely because they had never been tested by the crucible of real struggle. They mistook the sturdy scaffolding their father had built around them for a prison, completely failing to understand that the very walls keeping them safe were the only things preventing them from collapsing under the weight of the open world. Beside me, Margaret sat in quiet, unbroken stillness. Without a word, she reached across the narrow space between our seats, sliding her palm over mine. Her fingers were cool, yet her touch carried an anchor of warmth that steadied the chaotic storm raging beneath my ribs. For 28 years, we had weathered professional uncertainties, financial risks, and the quiet grief of building a family without the blueprint of our own parents' guidance. We did not need to exchange panicked reassurances or voice our darkest fears. Our shared history communicated everything. In that subtle gesture, she acknowledged the shared burden of our heartbreak, the terrifying realization that no matter how fiercely you love your children, you cannot legislate their wisdom, nor can you protect them from the consequences of their own deliberate unkindness. Outside the train window, the classic English landscape rolled past in a blur of charcoal skies, muted green fields, and slate-gray industrial towns stretching beneath a heavy, weeping canopy of clouds. The weather mirrored the bleak architecture of my thoughts, unforgiving, melancholic, and entirely stripped of color. Every town we passed felt like a silent witness to a life built on foundations of fierce devotion, now threatening to crumble under the weight of ungratefulness. I gripped Margaret's hand a fraction tighter as the train surged forward through the mist, heading steadily towards spinning fields, carrying us toward a destination where the illusion of our perfect family would finally be shattered beyond repair. The express train deposited us into the damp, industrial chill of Manchester shortly after midday, and within minutes, we found ourselves standing in the towering shadow of spinning fields. Arthur's building rose imposingly against the slate-gray northern skyline, a sleek monolith of glass, polished chrome, and reinforced concrete representing a level of elite prosperity that made an engineer from Birmingham feel quietly displaced in his own country. We rode the private elevator up to the 14th floor in absolute, suffocating silence. My hand trembled slightly as I raised it toward the doorway, the brass surface cold beneath my fingertips. 25 years of unrelenting fatherhood had culminated in this surreal moment, standing outside my own son's residence like a stranger waiting to identify a body. Then the auditory barrier broke. From behind the heavy oak paneling spilled the unmistakable sounds of high-spirited celebration, upbeat music, synchronized laughter, and the sharp, celebratory clinking of crystal glassware. Balloons were clustered neatly beside the doorframe, swaying gently in the ventilation draft. For one fleeting, agonizing second, a rush of pure relief flooded through my veins so intensely that my knees nearly buckled. Thank goodness, my mind whispered in desperate gratitude. They're safe. They are. Merely celebrating. I knocked, a steady, deliberate rap against the wood. The music lowered instantaneously. Soft footsteps approached from within. The mechanical click of the latch echoed sharply, and the door swung open. Standing in the frame was my eldest son, Arthur, holding a glass of champagne, a wide grin frozen halfway across his features, caught mid-transition between surprise and something considerably colder, an expression of profound irritation I had not witnessed since his teenage years. That momentary confusion evaporated in a heartbeat, curdling into an open, unfiltered resentment. In the half-second before language caught up with reality, my entire body understood what my mind refused to accept. I had not traveled across the country to rescue my son from peril. I had walked blindly into an ambush meticulously orchestrated against us. "What are you doing here?" Arthur demanded. Not father, not mother, not even a rudimentary expression of concern, like, "Is everything all right?" It was phrased precisely as though we were unwelcome commercial solicitors at his threshold, whom he now had to figure out how to dismiss. I attempted to keep my voice structurally level, though my chest felt as though it were folding inward under an intolerable weight. "I've been telephoning you for 3 days," I said, every word tasting like ash. "You did not respond. We feared something catastrophic had happened to you." Margaret pushed past me by a fraction, her hands flying instinctively to her mouth in a universal gesture of maternal shock. For one heart-wrenching second, I watched 25 years of selfless motherhood pour out of her eyes. "Oh, thank goodness," she gasped, her voice trembling. "Son, you're all right. We have been sick with worry. We thought—" Arthur interrupted her before she could complete the sentence. He rolled his eyes, not a minor, passing flick of frustration, but a full, theatrical, deeply exhausted motion of absolute disdain. It was the exact gesture children exhibit when burdened with a trivial chore. "We did not answer because we did not wish to speak with you." His voice cut through the corridor with the sharp, flat finality of a guillotine. "Blade, stop telephoning us. We have our own lives. You are suffocating us. Just stay away." For words. Throughout my life, I had endured industrial accidents, professional betrayals, and the profound, echoing void left by my own father's desertion. None of those trials landed with the destructive, crushing impact of those 3 sentences. I stood motionless in the corridor of the 14th floor, balloons bobbing mockingly against the doorframe, utterly devoid of speech. Before I could recover my breath, a young woman stepped gracefully into the doorway beside Arthur, holding a glass of rose champagne. Her entire posture radiated a smug, performative exhaustion. "Honestly," she interjected, crossing her arms defensively, "it is entirely overbearing. Do you ever stop hovering?" Margaret blinked, completely lost in the surreal horror of the moment. "Pardon me. Who are you?" The young woman's smile widened into something remarkably cruel. She raised her left hand deliberately, catching the hallway lights so that a diamond ring flashed brilliantly against our eyes. "I am Chloe," she stated, her tone dripping with entitlement. "His fiancée. And today is our engagement celebration, which you are currently ruining by showing up uninvited." The words echoed in the space, taking agonizing seconds to penetrate my consciousness. Our eldest son was engaged to be married, and we were discovering this monumental milestone while standing in a public hallway, being treated as trespassers at a celebration intentionally hidden from our sight. 28 years of marriage had never prepared me to witness the expression currently resting on Margaret's face. The look of a woman whose soul had just been struck with a bare hand. Behind our heartbreak, however, a cold, unyielding clarity began to take root. We had not been locked out by accident. We had been deliberately erased from the narrative of our own children's lives. For Margaret, the flash of that diamond ring did not merely represent an unfamiliar piece of jewelry. It struck directly at the quiet, sacred sanctuary of her maternal heart. Back home in our safe in Birmingham rested a treasured heirloom, a delicate, vintage family ring passed down through generations, carefully preserved in a faded velvet pouch, lovingly polished over decades while dreaming of the day it would grace the finger of whichever woman our son chose to welcome into our lives. Yet here, standing in a sterile 14th floor corridor in Spinningfields, she was confronted with a symbol of commitment chosen in secret, deliberately detached from any lineage, history, or familial blessing. The revelation carried a bitter irony. While Margaret had spent 20 years revering the continuity of heritage, her own children had casually discarded those very foundations for the sake of a modern, clinical aesthetic. The illusion that this agonizing estrangement was somehow accidental dissolved completely a heartbeat later, when Alistair appeared behind them carrying a tray of canapes, groaning audibly upon seeing us, as if we were an inconvenient chore. That was the moment the raw, unfiltered truth was laid bare before us. They had not missed our calls because of corporate exhaustion. They had not been trapped in boardrooms or struggling with failing batteries. They had watched our names light up their screens 14 times over 3 agonizing days, watched a mother's panic and a father's terror manifest in digital notifications, and they had deliberately chosen to let us suffer. Their silence was not an oversight. It was a calculated weapon, a psychological exercise designed to teach us a lesson about boundaries and control, weaponizing our unconditional love against us as a form of petty punishment. Standing there in the doorway, a profound psychological chasm opened before my eyes, illuminating the deep distortion of contemporary independence. There is a tragic paradox in the modern youth culture of entitlement. Children raised in absolute safety often mistake the sturdy scaffolding of parental sacrifice for a cage, rewriting their own history to cast the protectors as jailers. They confuse financial independence with moral autonomy, failing to grasp the fundamental distinction between a parent's desperate attempt to shield them from ruin and a dictator's desire to control. To them, our sleepless nights and relentless check-ins were not expressions of profound devotion, but inconvenient interruptions to their curated, self-absorbed lives. They demanded the full fruits of our lifelong labor, the corporate footholds, the luxury accommodations, the financial safety nets, while rejecting the very human cost required to build them. Yet, in that precise crucible of humiliation, something within me settled with absolute, unshakable finality. Lesser men might have yielded to a sudden fury, raising their voices, shattering the expensive glasswork, or descending into a bitter shouting match that would have validated every toxic narrative my sons had constructed about my character. But 52 years of weathering life's storms, from the profound vacuum of losing my own father at age 7 to building anvil engineering from a bare concrete floor, had taught me the ultimate defensive posture of a mature man: absolute, unyielding stillness. I did not yell. I did not curse. I looked past Arthur's defensive sneer and Chloe's performative arrogance, recognizing them not as malicious monsters, but as emotionally stunted boys playing at adulthood behind a fortress built with my credit. Gently, deliberately, I reached down, took my trembling wife's hand within my own, and turned our backs on the doorway. We had come seeking living sons. Instead, we found strangers who had traded their heritage for arrogance, leaving us no choice but to let reality collect the debts they were entirely unequipped to pay. The descent from the 14th floor into the lobby and the subsequent journey back to Birmingham unfolded in an emotional vacuum, heavier and more suffocating than any physical storm. We secured seats on the southbound afternoon train, the rhythmic metallic clatter of the tracks moving us steadily away from Manchester. Yet the distance between our physical location and the brutal reality of what we had just witnessed felt insurmountable. Margaret sat motionless beside the carriage window, staring fixedly out at the gray, weeping mid-afternoon sky. She did not sob or lament aloud. Instead, silent, crystalline tears traced slow paths down her cheeks, falling unheeded on her lap. The quiet, devastating grief of a mother whose 28 years of unsparing devotion had been met with calculated contempt. I kept my hand firmly over hers. Yet for the first time in our marriage, physical touch felt inadequate to bridge the vast, yawning chasm that had opened inside our chests. What comforting platitudes could possibly alter the fact that our own flesh and blood had watched us drown in terror and deliberately handed us the anchor? As the train cut through the flat, melancholic landscape of the English countryside, my mind turned inward, initiating a profound, unsparing interrogation of my own life as a father. For decades, I had tortured myself with the ghosts of my past, swearing that because my own father vanished when I was 7, My boys would never feel the biting frost of deprivation. I had labored through endless hours at Anvil Engineering, forging a fortress of financial security, strong credit lines, and absolute protection around them. But sitting there in the quiet carriage, a devastating truth finally crystallized in my consciousness. My fatal error was never that I loved my sons too intensely, but rather that I had constructed for them a flawless, sterile glass cage. I had shielded them from every sharp edge, every harsh winter wind, and every natural consequence of failure, believing that protection equaled virtue. In doing so, I had inadvertently crippled their capacity for empathy, raising two men who could casually witness our agony and treat it as a minor inconvenience because they had never once tasted the bitter, humbling salt of real struggle. The weight of that realization followed us all the way home, settling over our house in Birmingham like a shroud of palpable sorrow. When we finally unlocked our front door a little after dark, the familiar warmth of our hallway felt instantly transformed, the deep, echoing silence taking on sharp, physical teeth. Margaret could carry her composure no longer. The moment she crossed the threshold, her knees gave way beneath her, and she sank directly onto the living room rug, the same rug her own mother had gifted us on our wedding day. There, surrounded by the ordinary comforts of a home we had poured our souls into maintaining, she wept with the raw, guttural abandon of someone mourning a profound bereavement. I knelt beside her on the floor, abandoning every instinct of the fixer who spent his life calibrating machines and solving industrial crises, because this was a fracture no engineering skill could ever mend. Drawing her tightly against my shoulder, I allowed the question that had been tearing at my heart to finally slip past my lips into the quiet room. Where did we go wrong? I gave them everything I never had. I was the father I always wished for. And somehow, in doing that, I turned them into strangers who look at me like an enemy. Margaret slowly lifted her head, her eyes red and swollen from weeping, and delivered the singular truth that pierced through the darkness of that entire night. "No, Julian, you did not turn them into anything," she whispered, her voice steadying with a sudden, unbreakable resolve as she wiped her face with the back of her hand. "They chose that path themselves. You merely handed them a life they never had to work for, and people who never earned their foundation never learned to honor the hands that built it." Those words acted like a sudden, cleansing fire through my veins, incinerating the lingering remnants of parental guilt and blind grief. In that quiet embrace on the living room floor, a profound, absolute unity forged between us. There was no longer any room for naive excuses, maternal rationalization, or soft-hearted hesitation. We were entirely aligned, breathing as one, stepping forward into the cold dawn not as broken victims, but as two adults ready to let reality strip away the illusions we had funded for far too long. By sunrise, the emotional storm of the previous night had condensed into a cold, diamond-hard clarity. A man aligned completely with his wife is a formidable force, and Julian Cooper, with his purpose restored, is not a figure anyone should test lightly. At precisely 8 a.m., I picked up my desk phone and dialed Paul, our corporate solicitor whose office had handled Anvil Engineering's legal contracts in Birmingham for over a decade. Paul possesses that rare, razor-sharp, legal intellect that recognizes instantly when a client is calling about routine corporate maintenance versus a matter involving the profound dismantling of a personal life. This inquiry was unquestionably the latter. "Julian," he answered on the second ring, his tone measured and perceptive, "you sound like a man who has not slept in days. I do not waste breath on pleasantries. Paul, I need you to execute a formal revocation." I stated, every syllable clipped and deliberate. "Pull my name and financial backing off Arthur's residential lease guarantee in Spinningfields immediately before the midnight renewal window closes." There was a momentary pause on the line, the cautious hesitation of an experienced solicitor ensuring his client was not acting out of a temporary, emotional impulse that he would live to regret by lunch. "Are you entirely certain about this, Julian?" Paul cautioned gently. Under English property law, once a guarantor guarantee lapses without active renewal, the high-end management software flags the account automatically. There is no warning period, no administrative grace window for luxury developments like those in Manchester. I've never been more certain of anything in my entire life, I replied. Paul did not argue further. He simply understood the irrevocable shift in tone and immediately set the machinery of English commercial law into motion. By 9:15 a.m., the legal withdrawal notices were officially filed. By noon, the electronic signatures had been formally rescinded, cutting the invisible steel beam that had propped up Arthur's elite lifestyle for 2 full years. The midnight deadline came and passed without my backing attached to the registry, because for the first time since he moved to the city, there was no Julian Cooper standing silently behind his obligations to cushion the blow of reality. For 2 full days, absolute radio silence hung over us. Ironically, the very same cruel silence that had nearly broken my spirit a week prior now felt like a profound, restorative peace. The inevitable reckoning arrived on a Thursday afternoon while I was reviewing an industrial maintenance contract in my office. My mobile buzzed violently against the mahogany desk, illuminating Arthur's name. I let it ring twice before sliding my thumb across the screen to accept the call, allowing the cold weight of accountability to settle into the air. "Dad!" Arthur's voice erupted through the receiver, completely stripped of its previous arrogant polish, tight, clipped, and vibrating with a frantic, unhinged panic. "Dad, there is some catastrophic administrative error with the flat and spinning fields. The building management department just served us an official, non-negotiable notice to vacate within 43 hours, and they are hitting us with an immediate non-compliance penalty multiplier that doubles our monthly rental fee retroactively. They say there is no guarantor on file, and unless we clear the balance or provide verified corporate backing today, they are filing a formal county court judgment for breach of contract." I remained entirely silent for a heartbeat, letting the sharp friction of reality grind against his panic. When I finally spoke, my voice was dangerously calm, almost dangerously gentle, devoid of malice, yet heavier than lead. "There is no error, son," I replied evenly. "I officially revoked my guarantor status 2 days ago." Complete, suffocating dead silence swallowed the line, broken only by the ragged sound of his breathing. You did what?" he whispered, the disbelief cracking his voice. "Dad, why on earth would you do that? You know perfectly well I cannot qualify for an executive lease on my own junior salary yet. If they file an official legal eviction and a CCJ against my profile, it goes straight onto the public registry. My credit score will be completely destroyed, and Chloe and I won't even be able to rent a modest studio flat anywhere in the United Kingdom." I listened to the desperate architecture of his entitlement crumble under the weight of his own actions, remembering the cold dismissal in that Manchester hallway. "You told me to stay away," I answered quietly, my words carrying the finality of a closing iron gate. "You told me I was suffocating you, that you had your own life and did not need my interference. So, I'm simply respecting your exact wishes. Dad, please, you have to call the management office immediately. Tell them it was a clerical mistake. Tell them you'll sign the papers." "It was never a mistake, Arthur," I said, before severing the connection with a decisive tap of my thumb. The law of the land had spoken, and for the first time in his life, my son was forced to stare into the mirror of his own choices without my shadow to soften the reflection. Without the invisible shield of my financial backing, the gleaming, fragile illusion of Arthur's high society existence in Manchester evaporated with terrifying speed. In the unforgiving ecosystem of the British rental market, sentimentality does not exist, and administrative grace is entirely foreign to corporate property management firms. Within 48 hours of my revocation reaching their desks, the legal machinery engaged without a shred of hesitation. Because Arthur's individual credit score was utterly insufficient to sustain an executive lease in spinning fields on its own, his rating collapsed instantly under the weight of the defaulted agreement. The management did not offer extensions or emotional appeals. They enforced the strict protocols of English contract law, treating his glamorous lifestyle with the cold, bureaucratic indifference it truly deserved. The reality of that collapse manifested in a scene far more humbling than any courtroom drama. Gone were the days of celebratory champagne, glittering engagement parties, and looking down from the 14th floor at the vibrant pulse of Manchester. Instead, the luxury apartment became a site of frantic, humiliating labor. Alastair, whose own financial standing was inextricably tethered to his brother's fragile network, had rushed down from the northern quarter to assist, though his presence offered no practical salvation. For 48 straight hours, the two young men who had so arrogantly declared their complete independence were forced to perform a task they had never anticipated, scrambling through high-end designer boutiques and minimalist Scandinavian furniture, frantically stuffing their clothes, electronics, and personal possessions into rough brown cardboard boxes. There were no professional movers, no cheering fiancés, and no sympathetic audience. As they wheeled their pathetic inventory down the gleaming corridors and through the pristine marble lobby on cheap luggage carts, the building's security guards watched with silent, impassive expressions. The exact same lobby where, just weeks prior, they had treated their own mother with unmitigated contempt. Yet, the eviction from spinning fields was merely the opening tremor of a much larger financial earthquake that systematically dismantled their carefully curated world. The collapse acted with the ruthless precision of a domino effect across the broader British banking sector. Alastair's ambitious side ventures, which had been secretly sustained by corporate lines of credit indirectly secured through my company's assets, were frozen overnight when the lending institutions reevaluated our risk portfolios and revoked his authorization. Simultaneously, the finance house holding the agreement on Alastair's luxury vehicle flag his deteriorating credit profile as high risk, demanding an immediate restructuring of the loan or the immediate surrender of the keys. Stripped of the collateral and guarantees they had taken entirely for granted, both brothers watched helplessly as the institutional pillars, holding up their inflated self-images, were systematically repossessed by banks that cared nothing for their grand ambitions or youthful entitlement. Standing back in my quiet office in Birmingham, while these cascading failures unfolded through legal notifications, I felt no malice, only a profound, sobering clarity regarding the immutable laws of human nature. There is a brutal, unwritten philosophy that governs the real world. It simply does not and cannot. Dung-tung for those who spend their lives lounging comfortably beneath the shade of another man's tree without ever learning how to plant their own roots. True maturity cannot be purchased, inherited, or artificially simulated with borrowed credit. It is forged only when the artificial safety nets are completely burned away, leaving a person standing entirely exposed in the howling wind of their own accountability. My sons had demanded the absolute right to stand alone, free from my supposed suffocation, and the universe had finally granted their wish with terrifying literalness, proving at last that while a father can build a palace with his bare hands, he can never legislate the wisdom required to keep it standing. 3 weeks after the collapse of their fragile existence in Manchester, reality delivered its final, undeniable reckoning to our doorstep in Birmingham. The evening shadows were lengthening across the quiet residential street when the low, heavy rumble of a rented commercial moving van broke the stillness, pulling up directly against our front curb. The vehicle looked battered and worn, its faded white paneling bearing the scars of long-distance transit, a pathetic contrast to the gleaming Porsches and high-end executive saloons that used to grace our driveway. Through the front window, I watched as Arthur and Alastair stepped out onto the pavement. They did not look like successful, independent young men carving out their own destinies. They looked like spectral ghosts of the ambitions they had once flaunted, broken by the unforgiving weight of a monthly budget devoid of my signature. Alastair was the one who marched up our front path, his face pale, drawn, and flushed with a bitter, desperate fury, pounding aggressively against our wooden door as if the very hinges owed him an apology for existing. I opened the door, and without a word of greeting, let them step past the threshold into the exact same living room where Margaret had wept weeks before. They did not enter with humility or a willingness to mend what they had shattered. They entered trailing an aura of righteous grievance, expecting the familiar safety net to rise up and catch them by default. Arthur began speaking before he had even crossed the center of the rug, his voice cracking with real, jagged tears that leaked from his eyes, though it took only a heartbeat to remember that emotional distress does not automatically equate to genuine moral accountability. "How could you do this to us?" His voice echoed sharply off the polished hardwood, trembling with unadulterated outrage. "We are your own flesh and blood. You are intentionally dismantling our lives over a minor family disagreement, and you know perfectly well that my wedding is just around the corner." I did not flinch, nor did I raise my voice to match his frantic pitch. I remained standing beside the mantelpiece, my posture completely empty of anger, replaced entirely by a profound, unshakable serenity. "A minor disagreement?" I asked, my tone level and chillingly quiet. "You watched your mother and me call you 14 times while we were sick with absolute terror, fearing you were dead in a ditch. You ignored us deliberately, on purpose, simply to teach your father a lesson about boundaries. Now, the world is teaching you a much harder lesson about consequence." Arthur's expression twisted instantly, his grief curdling into a desperate, frantic panic as he realized the emotional manipulation was failing. "You are just a bitter, controlling tyrant who cannot bear the thought of us not needing you anymore," he screamed, his words tearing through the room. "You engineered this whole catastrophe as a sick revenge plot just because we did not invite you to a private celebration." I looked straight into his eyes, holding his gaze with absolute steadiness. "I did not want to see you fail, son, but you stood in that doorway in spinning fields and told me explicitly that you did not need my suffocating help, that you were entirely self-reliant man. I'm simply honoring your exact wish. If you truly do not need me, then you do not need my name on your lease, my collateral for your business ventures, or my credit to secure your vehicles. That is not revenge. That is the uncompromising definition of adulthood." Arthur's jaw tightened into a rigid line as he frantically searched his mind for another angle of attack, like a desperate man hunting for keys in empty pockets. Desperate, he pivoted toward the kitchen doorway, raising his voice to catch Margaret. "Mother would never have allowed this cruelty," he pleaded, playing his final, predictable card. "You are acting behind her back, aren't you? You're punishing us because you're vindictive." That was the precise moment Margaret stepped smoothly from the kitchen into the living room, her arms crossed defensively over her chest, her voice carrying a rock-solid resonance I had not heard since before that brutal day in Manchester. "Your father and I are entirely, unequivocally on the same page," she stated, her words dropping like smooth stones into a quiet pool, completely devoid of hesitation or doubt. "We discussed every single decision together. We both agreed that the only honorable path left was to respect your fierce demand to be left entirely alone." Alistair, who had remained brooding and silent near the window up to that point, finally snapped under the weight of her words. "Mother, you cannot possibly be serious," he barked in disbelief. I stepped forward, placing one reassuring hand firmly upon Margaret's shoulder, anchoring our unified front against their storm of blame. "So, here we are," I concluded softly. "We are leaving you alone, exactly as you requested. Good fortune to you both." We watched the final realization dawn across their faces, the cold, crushing comprehension that this was neither a temporary bluff nor a passing phase, and that their father would not cave simply because they cried loud enough in his living room. They lingered for a few more minutes, hurling accusations, casting blame for their eviction and financial ruin, trying desperately to make us shoulder the wreckage of their own choices. But as I listened to them, I felt no guilt, no remorse, only an overwhelming sense of clarity. These were the exact same young men who had told us to stay away. Now, they only wanted someone else to carry the financial burden once they discovered they could not survive the open air alone. They departed into the night without another word, their footsteps heavy on the gravel path. As the front door clicked shut behind them and the rental van's engine sputtered to life before fading down the residential street, the silence that enveloped our house did not feel like grief anymore. For the first time in months, it felt like absolute, permanent peace. The final chapter of this profound journey did not conclude with anger or retribution, but with the quiet, deliberate restoration of order. The week following my son's departure, I returned to Paul's office in Birmingham, bringing an absolute closure to a lifetime of misplaced stewardship. "I wish to rewrite my will, Paul," I told him, sliding a fresh document across his polished mahogany desk with a steady hand. "Completely. If I precede Margaret, all assets and properties transfer entirely to her. If she passes before me, everything transfers to her name. And if we are both gone—" I paused, feeling a deep, settling peace wash over my chest rather than a tearing ache. "Zero inheritance goes to the boys. Not a single pound. Instead, establish a perpetual charitable trust funding educational scholarships for the children of British military veterans and fallen servicemen. Young boys and girls who understand the profound, echoing void of losing a father, and who would trade almost anything just to have a parent call them once and genuinely mean it. That is where my legacy belongs. All of it." Paul did not question my judgment or ask me to reconsider. He simply nodded, adjusted his spectacles, made the structural notes, and set the legal machinery into motion to honor a truer definition of duty. Months have quietly slipped away since that afternoon, and the sharp edges of our grief have softened into a permanent, restorative calm. The calls from Arthur and Alistair dwindled to silence, and we later learned through a mutual family friend that they had relocated to a modest, cramped apartment together somewhere on the outer edges of the city, learning the hard way what a monthly budget actually signifies when your name is no longer artificially propped up by another man's credit. I will not pretend that hearing of their struggles does not leave a faint, lingering ache within my heart. It does, for a father's instinct is never entirely excised by logic. But every time that hollow ache begins to creep back into my chest, I close my eyes and I am instantly back in that spinning field's hallway, hearing the cold words "stay on your own," and watching the heartbreaking shadow cross my wife's face over a ring that never received its rightful moment. The ache retreats, settling precisely back where it belongs, replaced by the unyielding dignity of truth. Today, Margaret and I spend our peaceful evenings sitting together on our rear patio in Birmingham. Right as the late summer sun begins its slow, amber descent over the same lawn, where two young boys once learned to ride bicycles, I had stayed up half the night assembling. The air is cool, carrying the gentle scent of damp English earth and blooming roses. Not long ago, as we watched the sky bleed from gold to deep twilight, Margaret reached across the narrow wooden table and placed her hand softly over mine. The exact same gentle, grounding gesture she has offered me 1,000 times through every trial of our 28 years of marriage. In that serene moment, looking into her eyes, a profound realization settled deep into my soul. My own father was stolen from me by a deployment that never returned, and I spent my entire existence striving desperately to become the unbreakable figure he never had the opportunity to be. Yet, somewhere along the winding, difficult path of protecting everyone else, I had momentarily forgotten the most essential. Only person who truly required my unwavering protection, my undivided devotion, and my truest love through every storm was the remarkable woman sitting quietly beside me the entire time. My sons have chosen their own paths, constructing their individual lives precisely as they demanded in that Manchester doorway. And my wife and I, we have one another, anchored by a shared history no bitterness can ever fracture. And that, it turns out, is infinitely more than enough. If this narrative resonated with the quiet truths of your own life, please select the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave your thoughtful perspective in the comments below. Let me know from where you are watching today. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next story.